So today I'm going to use slides. I usually don't use slides, so we'll see how that goes. Try it out. And today's day is about end-of-life issues. And this talk now is supposed to be sort of introductory, okay? I'm going to maybe cover three things. A little bit of meditation on the meaning of suffering and death from a Catholic perspective. Very basic introduction to terminology about euthanasia and the ethical dimension of it. And then the third part will be about Ars Moriendi, which is Latin for the art of dying. There's a lot of literature about it from around 1400 to 1700, and it was a rich part of Catholic tradition that we've lost. Ars Moriendi, and another thing called Memento, mori. And I'll talk about those after we do the introductory parts. And one thing, Pope Benedict in his letter Deus Caritas Est, God is Love, and also Pope John Paul II in his apostolic letter Salvifici Doloris on the meaning of Christian suffering, they both very sensitively and beautifully talk about how just because we're Christians, we don't get a pass on the difficulty of suffering, including the understanding of why. We ask that question, why, the same as everybody else. Why? Why is there suffering? And here's just something quite striking from paragraph 38 of Deus Caritas Est. In the midst of that meditation, Pope Benedict says, it's good to ask the why. He even thinks it's an act of faith in God. And then he says, because for the believer it is impossible to imagine that God is powerless or that perhaps he is asleep. Instead, our crying out is, as it was for Jesus on the cross, the deepest and most radical way of affirming our faith in his sovereign power. Even in their bewilderment and failure to understand the world around them, Christians continue to believe in the goodness and loving kindness of God, immersed like everyone else in the dramatic complexity of historical events. They remain unshakably certain that God is our Father and loves us, even when his silence remains incomprehensible. So, like we were talking about mysteries the other day, Mysterium Iniquitatis, the mystery of evil which the medievals wrote about, it's a mystery, like the other mysteries we were talking about. Now, in John Paul II's letter, Salvifici Doloris, he tries to probe this question of why, and he gives an answer. He says that the meaning of suffering is that it unleashes love. Now, even in that letter, John Paul also talks about how the book of Job is a breakthrough, because in the rest of the Old Testament, except for some of the Psalms, suffering is thought of as punishment for sin. And Job's friends, come on, what'd you do? Remember? They say, but Job didn't do anything. And John Paul says, Job is the cry of innocent suffering. It's real. Innocent suffering happens. There is intense suffering that does not match some sin somebody did. And that's what's hard to understand. All the other views like Buddhism and Stoicism, they try to delete suffering in one way, but hedonism and Epicureanism and these things, you might think Stoicism and hedonism are opposites, but they're not. Because they have the same underlying desire to delete the experience of suffering from human experience. One with pleasure and one with stoic sternness. But Christianity, it says Jesus loved those who are in the world and he loved them to the end. And we might think, wow, that's amazing. Somebody can be tortured and love at the same time. That's quite astounding. Someone can do those two things at the same time. It is astounding. But that phrase, Jesus loved them to the end, I don't think it means he just did both at the same time. It means that those two go together in Christian thought. It's sort of hard to express this in words, but the more suffering, the more love. Like, it's as if he could have redeemed us, they say, with a prick of a pin or something, but there is some link between suffering and love which makes them both grow. And for people who look at Christianity and aren't Christians, that usually makes them think, at best, Christianity is odd, and at worst, they might think it's masochistic. If you don't understand a certain depth of the relationship between suffering and love. And we can't even fully understand it, but we know it's true. You can understand it, and that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today, in human experience, and that's what the Ars Moriendi is based on. This idea that there's an experiential redemption that happens in human suffering, even between people who aren't believers. We'll talk about that a little bit. So it can unleash love. It can unleash love. And he develops that further. I'm tempted to go down that path, but I won't. It's a very beautiful letter about how John Paul develops this idea of the interior and exterior and cultural unleashing of love, which can happen in the midst of suffering if we choose to do our best to make the right responses to it. The right responses to it. You see sometimes very striking ones, like that prayer that was found in the Birkenau or Ravensbrück concentration camp. The people were praying. There were Christians in there. I don't know if you've heard that prayer, but they were praying. They found it like crumpled up in someone's pocket. And it said something like, "O Lord, remember not only men of goodwill, but also those of ill will, and remember all the fruits that have come to us from this." And they list them: our generosity, our greatness of heart, the love that we've grown. And then the last line of the prayer that they were praying every day was, "And when they, our torturers, come to judgment, let the fruits that we have borne be their forgiveness." They were praying that. And you could ask yourself, if those people had not gone into a concentration camp and just led a cush middle-class life in Vienna, and you went up to them and said, "Do you think that if that was your life, you would have ever gotten to that level of loving your enemies?" I think they would say no. It doesn't justify a concentration camp. You don't go around hurting people on purpose to make more love unleash. But there is that mysterious link that if people respond to love in the right way, that's what Frankl I was talking about too. We got Maximilian Kolbe and the capos. So there's a connection to your freedom. So there's some ordination within suffering towards the unleashing of love. And ultimately that comes from the fall. Like if there was never a fall, I think we would have great love without suffering. But so that's a certain mystery. Now, I just want to read one more thing that I already read to you. I'm going to be doing that twice today, but just to get it back into our minds, and there's a couple new people here. And that is when when Pope Benedict went on the TV show, and the woman said, "Your Holiness, has the soul of my son Francesco, who has been in a vegetative coma since Easter Sunday 2009, left his body, seeing that he is no longer conscious, or is it still near him?" And I'm going to read Benedict's answer again. He said to her, "Certainly, his soul is still present in his body. The situation perhaps is like that of a guitar whose strings have been broken and therefore can no longer play. The instrument of the body is fragile like that. It is vulnerable, and the soul cannot play, so to speak, but remains present. I am also sure that this hidden soul feels your love deep down, even if unable to understand the details, your words, etc. He feels the presence of love. Your presence, therefore, dear parents, dear mother, next to him for hours and hours every day is the true act of a love of great value, because this presence enters into the depth of that hidden soul. Your act is thus also a witness of faith in God, of faith in man, of commitment to life, even in the saddest of situations." And then he encourages her to keep going. And that idea of the saddest of situations. And it's very beautiful, that reflection. And it's what we were talking about yesterday, that love is present even when consciousness is diminished. And that saddest of situations, this is why people are, well, we'll talk a little bit about the motives for, and you'll hear more about it later today too, the motives for requesting euthanasia. But there's a certain call that Christians have in some of these very difficult situations to keep going. Okay, so so Mother Teresa of Calcutta, famous quote, said, "If we have no peace, it is because we have forgotten that we belong to one another." And that's something we were talking about the other day too, the community and the dependence. We depend on it. We're all vulnerable, actually, not just sick people like this little boy. We're all vulnerable in the sense, some of the community senses that we talked about before, the need to. And in fact, another beauty, and God set it up this way. I found this quote from Cardinal Ratzinger. "We have seen that the inability to accept one's I, oneself, leads to the inability to accept a thou. But how does one go about affirming, assenting one's I? The answer may perhaps be unexpected. We cannot do so by our own efforts. Of ourselves, we cannot come to terms with ourselves. Our I becomes acceptable to us only if it has first become acceptable to another I. We can love ourselves only if we have been first loved by someone else. We can't believe in our own goodness." It's there ontologically, but another person has to love you for you to experientially believe in your own goodness, your own preciousness, your own uniqueness. That's a vulnerability that we all have, and it's also a little scary. We're like the custodians of the truth about each other. And this type of love that we know in normal human life, there's that line from the Catechism that it says this, I forget which paragraph, but the sick and the vulnerable and the injured need more attention than the healthy. It's not because they're worth more than us, the healthy. It's because there's a temptation to think that they aren't. But this love is called for to everyone, even the sick. All right. John Paul, this is a famous letter, a speech that he gave about vegetative states to some scientists. And he said, "There are some who cast doubt on the persistence of the human quality itself, almost as if the adjective vegetative, which is now solidly established, which symbolically describes a clinical state, could or should instead be implied to the sick as such, demeaning their value. In opposition to such trends of thought, I feel the duty to reaffirm strongly that the intrinsic value and personal dignity of every human being do not change, no matter what the concrete circumstances of his or her life. A man, even if seriously ill or disabled, in the exercise of his highest function, is and always will be a man and never will become a vegetable or an animal." So the people retain their dignity, and he wanted to make that point. So there's this foundational question. Is the sick or dying person placed at the center of attention? Or is the sick or dying person abandoned or isolated or ignored? There's that book, Being Mortal, by Atul Gawande. I don't know if you've read that, but this whole theme of that is a certain ignoring or abandoning of the elderly in nursing homes. And we need to, our culture puts a lot of emphasis on the healthy. Look at all the money we put into the NFL and all the money, and it would be better if we emptied the field of the players but kept all the cheering and the money and put the sick people on the field. That's how we should change our whole underlying attitude. Okay, so all right. So there's two causes of death. I'm being, as I said, this is very introductory. Two big categories: natural death and being killed. Okay, so natural death, you can die by old age, illness, organ failure, disease, or an injury. And then killing is someone killing someone else or someone killing themselves. Simple distinction. And the difference between the two sides are, they both agree that euthanasia is death by killing. It's sort of an unfortunate shift. The word means good death, but over time it has come to refer to killing somebody to end their suffering. I have a definition in a minute. And they both agree. The people on the pro-life and the pro-euthanasia side both agree that euthanasia is killing somebody on purpose. That's what it is. You have to sort of get your terms clear at the beginning to even have a healthy disagreement. But the pro-life side says that death should always be natural. Everyone should die a natural death. And the pro-euthanasia side says sometimes it's morally acceptable to kill people. That's what they say. Some of them might try to obfuscate that on the news, but that's what they say. All right. Here's the other one part that I'm going to repeat from yesterday. So the original Hippocratic Oath said, I will neither give a deadly drug to anybody who asks for it, nor will I make a suggestion to this effect. We'll just do that part. So Hippocrates knew not only that he shouldn't kill somebody, but that he wouldn't even suggest it. And I'm going to maybe go a little bit out of order in my slides as thoughts occur to me because I'm not reading a paper. But you can add, one of the things we can do in the Q&A, if you want to, is think up some of the strongest arguments against the pro-life position, and we can talk them through as best as we can. But one is that the pro-life side, the pro-euthanasia side says it's greater freedom, right? They can choose, and we restrict their freedom. And Wesley Smith is good on this. He wrote this book, Forced Exit. But you can ask yourself the question, why did Hippocrates say, why did he say, I won't even suggest it to somebody? And then is legalizing euthanasia the same thing as suggesting to a person that they kill themselves? It is. It is. If euthanasia is not legalized, if it's off the table, you're more free. Because if it's legal, there's an inherent coercion in there that makes the sick person think, maybe I should do this. Maybe people don't want me here. Maybe I'm using up resources. So I would say that legalizing euthanasia thwarts freedom because it adds an element of coercion where we're supposed to be loving the person. And Hippocrates said, not even suggest that horrible thought to them that make them think we don't want them. So it attacks freedom to legalize it in that sense. And then, as you know, we heard about this a couple times over the week. The 1964 version and many of the newly rewritten ones, they change that line. But they make it sound sugar-coated. I must tread with care in matters of life and death. If it is given to me to save a life, all thanks. But it also may be within my power to take a life. And all the rest of that is farce. Because if you kill someone, you are playing God. I talked about this the other day. So that's the 1964 version. And they're saying, and now lots of oaths have it that way. And I said the PBS website is being dishonest by calling Dr. Lasagna's oath from 1964 version the modern version of the Hippocratic Oath because it says you can't be more opposite to what Hippocrates said. He said, I will never kill. This guy's saying, I will kill. It should say the Lasagna Oath. It's calumny. It's against Hippocrates. All right. Okay, I gave a talk a few months, about a year ago, in New York State about this topic because they were debating, like all these states are, a law. This is a line from the law that was in question then, which didn't pass, but I'm sure it'll be back up again. But it says, one of the lines in the law says, no person shall qualify for medical aid in dying under this article solely because of age or disability. I put that word wedge law in there to remind myself. Whenever these euthanasia laws get enacted, they always start out with guidelines, really strict ones, like that. So nobody's going to be able to come in and say, I'm 80 years old, which is legal now in Holland. Did you hear recently a law just passed in Holland? It's called the Completeness of Life Law. I think the limit is 75 years old, and someone can just go into their doctor and say, they're not sick. I'm 75. I would like access to this law because I'm done with my life. It's been nice, and that's legal in Holland. But even that little, I'm being funny right now, but that's ageism. That's ageism. Because some 73-year-old is going to come in there and say, hey, this isn't fair. And that will happen, and that last guideline will be gone. So these laws, they're all wedge laws. What they want you to do, and that's why I wrote 180 down there, is so up until now, Hippocrates till now, no, we will not kill. These laws, even though they put all these little guidelines in, or big guidelines in, they are doing a 180. They are going from we will never kill to we will kill. Doctors will never kill to we will kill. That's a 180. At the beginning, they make the box really small of who we're going to kill, but it's a 180. And that's the reason why guidelines never work. They're actually, I would say, if you want to be the most cynical about it, they want them not to work. But they have to start with a strict guideline to get society to vote for it. But then as time goes by, the guidelines get broken off. And that's why, and Wesley Smith and others write about how in Germany you can trace historical development to the legalization of euthanasia that ends up in the concentration camps. And the reason is because the reason why people, if they debate it on the news, they bring up those historical examples, and the pro-euthanasia side says, well, but we can learn from that. Human beings are smart. We'll stick to our guidelines. They often say there won't be any abuses. That's a contradiction. That is an abuse. That's an abuse. Killing one person because they're sick is already an abuse. When they say we won't have abuses, that doesn't make sense. And that's why the guidelines don't work. Once you take out the inviolability of the person, every guideline is like putting a Band-Aid on an arm that's been chopped off. That's why guidelines don't work. And I would suggest the people who build the laws know that, and they're going to gradually get rid of all the guidelines. And now even, I mentioned Peter Singer the other day about his mother, but he also, and I heard some of you were praying for him. That's good. But he now argues. He's got an article that I go through with my students. I try to give the strongest arguments that they have in favor and the strongest against in my classes. And I think the truth bears out the truth. But he has some pretty well thought out arguments that it's unfair that it's only physically ill people who get access to euthanasia laws. He thinks depression with physical health should be a legitimate reason for people to be able to kill themselves via euthanasia laws. And we can talk about that maybe in the Q&A. I want to make sure I want to make sure I get through my slides. Okay. So the definition of euthanasia: an action or omission which of itself or by intention causes death in order that suffering may be eliminated. So we got action and omission. I'll talk about those in a minute. And then the terms of reference are to be found in the intention of the will and the methods used. And we went through object, intention, circumstances already. So the intention is, you want someone not to be in pain. That's a good intention. And the object in euthanasia, the moral choice, is to kill them, to get rid of the pain. Okay. So by action, euthanasia by action is deliberately killing somebody, like giving them an overdose. You just go up, you say you're going to be dead because your suffering is too bad, and then you give them an overdose on purpose to make them be dead so they're not suffering. Okay. Euthanasia by omission, this one sometimes is a little bit harder to conceptualize, and it needs to be carefully distinguished later from something that is acceptable. But euthanasia by omission is not acceptable. The way I usually get people to conceptualize it is if someone had, by this analogy, if someone had a lot of money to gain, say, if someone else died, and they killed the person and got away with it, then that would be analogous to euthanasia by action. But if they were walking in the woods, let's say, and the person fell down and hit their head and was lightly unconscious but in a puddle of water face down, and the person who had the money to gain stood there and went, oh, la-di-da-di-da, until they... If that was found out, they would be convicted of some degree of murder, and because it was a simple thing. They just could have turned them over and said, hey, wake up. So they omitted doing a very basic caring act on purpose, which caused their death, which is different from shooting them, but it's just as bad. So euthanasia by omission, we're going to talk about it more, like to not feed someone, like if someone needs help eating, but they're not dying, and you just say, I'm not feeding you. Well, you're just doing that la-di-da thing and they die of starvation. That would be euthanasia by omission. Okay. There are three basic. There's voluntary euthanasia when the person requests to be killed. There's non-voluntary euthanasia when the person has made no request to be killed. And that's becoming more and more legal in places like Holland and Belgium where they're way ahead of the curve. Doctors just get to decide if certain people or children are in states where they can just decide to kill them. And then involuntary euthanasia, normally that's called straight up murder, but sometimes that happens. You read these stories sometimes where someone's like struggling, maybe they started it and then they don't want to die and people hold them down and there's other, okay. So and then two kinds of euthanasia, typically pretty much in Europe. This is an interesting distinction actually. I don't know if I've thought through why this is the case. Maybe some of the doctors later can. But in Europe, when they legalize euthanasia, they legalize it where the doctor does the killing. But in America, when they legalize it, you have to kill yourself, but the doctor explains it to you and mixes the lethal dose. That's a difference between America and Europe in these laws. It's an interesting difference. Okay. Maybe it's just malpractice suits are more here. All right, so two tragic cases that you've probably heard of. Terri Schiavo, that was euthanasia by omission. And that's the most important thing about her case. She was not dying. She wasn't dying. Her family just wanted to take her home and care for her like this lady was caring for her son Francesco. And the courts ordered her to be starved and dehydrated. They had to watch her. There's a police officer in the room, and he wouldn't even let them put lip gloss on her or ice chips. It was pretty horrific. And then Brittany Menard is an example of euthanasia by action. She was the young woman, 29. That was another thing. She was only, I think, 29. So the media launched. Normally people think euthanasia old, but her case opened up a new market, you could say. And so she went up to Oregon because it was illegal at that time in California. And she had a brain tumor, which a lot of other people have had, including one of the seminarians where I was teaching at the time. He's now Father Philip Johnson. And he and others wrote letters to her that he had the same disease. And they're like, you can live, you can have a good life. But she did it. Okay. Now, this is a sort of interesting thing. There are actually 3 positions on euthanasia, not just 2. There's not just the pro-life and the pro-euthanasia. There's also what's called vitalism. So I'm using that as a problematic view. I'm using the word vitalism as a problematic view. And some people equate, even Singer does this in some of his articles, he doesn't make that distinction. And he'll say, oh, but you people will remove certain treatments, so you're not totally pro-life, but it's false. It's a misunderstanding, and I'm going to try to explain it. Okay, but before we get to what those 3 are, so there's 2 fears. There's a nice little article by Christian Bruegger that outlines this. There's a fear of dying, which is, and we're going to talk about when we get to Ars Moriendi. And so there's a problem of over-treatment, which is connected to that vitalist view. And then there's a fear of pain, and more so pain, loneliness, and things like this, or fear of losing dignity in the sense of needing help. You don't lose your ontological dignity. And people want to get a hasty exit. That would be killing them. So those are 2 dangers, over-treatment and euthanasia. So that dysthanasia, it's a little article by Dr. Pilar Calva. She defines it as overzealous therapy or therapeutic obstinacy. That word occurs in church documents too. The opposite of euthanasia consists in delaying death as long as possible using every possible means, even though there is no hope for a cure and despite the great suffering caused by the treatment. And this, I think I do this next. Yeah, this is helpful. If you make the word futility, if you clearly distinguish two meanings of it, then you can understand these distinctions better. The first meaning of futility, I put a little 1, 2's coming up on the next slide, is the correct meaning of futility. And that refers to treatment. Futile describes treatment which doesn't achieve its finality. Like an example would be a cancer patient who goes through 2 or 3 or 4 rounds of chemo and the cancer keeps coming back. Then the chemo can be called futile because it's not doing what it's supposed to do. So a treatment can be futile because it doesn't achieve its end. And if you keep pushing that, then you're getting into this overzealous treatment situation. But one thing that's happening with the word futile is this false meaning of it, which is any treatment a physician or a hospital doesn't want to provide. and there, it's the patient. The second meaning of futile, which is in the literature now, is the patient is futile, not the treatment. It's disrespectful. The patient is considered no longer considered worthless, you could say. And so here, I reference this, but it's good to read that book. He went around helping people, Wesley Smith did, who were he's a lawyer and he writes about bioethics, and very beautiful, and some are sad stories. He just goes around trying to help people who the euthanasia movement is trying to get to kill themselves. By the way, one of the stories in there, which will relate to the point I want to make, the main point I want to make, is that in one of the cases, there were these 3 guys trying to get this other guy to go through with killing himself, and one of the 3 was visiting him regularly, talking about how do you want to do it, which medications and so forth, and they noticed that the guy, every time the one visited, the sick guy, he wanted to go through with it less, and they realized that he started to believe that this guy was his friend. And that was why he sort of now wanted to live. But that's one of the tragic stories. The 3 guys realized that and they said, oh, stop going. Because they wanted him to do it. That's sick. But there's some beautiful stories in Wesley's book where he actually gets to save people, or it's very nice. It's just a bunch of true stories that happen. But anyways, so he talks about how in all futile care cases, the treatment is unwanted by the doctors because it is working. This is futility number 2. The patient, they think, is futile. So the treatment's working, okay? And that's bad. That's a new thing that's part of this euthanasia ethos. Let me just write down your questions. We'll get through the slides and then, okay. So, is it morally, from a Catholic perspective, is it morally acceptable to refrain from or cease medical intervention? And here we're going to talk a little bit about this ordinary proportionate care and extraordinary disproportionate care. And you may forego extraordinary or disproportionate care. I'm going to develop a little bit why, but not ordinary or proportionate care. Okay. So yes, death. What is death? We talked about it a little bit the other day. It's the separation of the soul from the body. And anyone can see that. I mean, even Aristotle, when he started talking about these topics way back when, he's like, okay, there's a dog running around, the next day the dog's dead. What's different? The life principle is gone, something left. And he called that the soul. And then we're not going to philosophize about the soul more today, but we did that to some extent already. So the common sense definition is when the life principle, the anima, the soul, leaves the body. And this is why vitalism is false. Because nobody can escape death. It is part of life. Actually, to die is a human act that you can perform well or not well. Some authors think it's the most important act. You could debate different acts, but it's a human act actually to die, yeah. the dying process is a human. You need to participate in that in certain ways. Okay, all right. So when death is present, which is unavoidable, one way that you can express the reason why the Catholic view says that it is up to the patient to decide if they want what's called extraordinary treatment. It's optional morally. The reason is because choosing to forego extraordinary treatment is the humble acceptance of the presence of death. Choosing to forego extraordinary treatment is the humble acceptance of the presence of death. It is not killing. Okay. And then entry into eternal life. Okay. I just said that. It's permitting death to happen. And it's a natural death because of some pathology. Okay, they die, and then, yes, of course, but even when that decision is made, you never stop caring for, Dr. John Traveline, who couldn't be here because he's celebrating his anniversary, he says in his talk, I love this story, I even tell my students it, he's a doctor at Temple University, and he says that when the residents come to him and say, I got to get this right, they say, something like, we're discontinuing care on this patient in this room. He says, no, we're not. And they say, yes, we are. And he says, no, we never do that. And then he gets them to understand the difference in their mind between discontinuing extraordinary treatment but never stopping to care for this person, even when you do that. Okay? All right. So here's from the Catechism. Discontinuing medical procedures that are burdensome, dangerous, extraordinary, or disproportionate to the expected outcome can be legitimate. It is the refusal of overzealous treatment. Here, one does not will to cause death. One's inability to impede it is merely accepted. The decision should be made by the patient if he is competent or able, if not by those legally entitled to act for the patient, whose reasonable will and legitimate interests must be respected. By the way, the flip side of that is, somebody may want an extraordinary treatment, which is maybe painful or difficult in some way because it will maybe give them one more week. Maybe they're waiting for someone to come home that they want to talk to. So it's not immoral to use extraordinary treatment. It's morally optional according to the Catholic Church. And if you choose not to, you're merely accepting the inevitability of death. That's not killing. Okay. But even if death is thought imminent, the ordinary care owed to the sick person cannot be legitimately interrupted by the people attending to the sick person and by the sick person. They both have a moral obligation to provide ordinary care. Now, okay, so people always want to know in the class, what's ordinary care? Give me a list. Strictly speaking, you can't give a list, but I made one because people always ask that question. And the medical doctors in the room can talk about, like, some of these sometimes are ordinary and some of these sometimes are extraordinary, depending on certain situations. But I think a fair list of things that can fall into the ordinary category, maybe these are some. Nutrition and hydration, including artificial, which we're going to have a talk on later. Cleanliness, warmth, bed care, appropriate rehabilitative care, monitoring signs of recovery, blood transfusions and antibiotics. I know sometimes those could be extraordinary. Insulin, yeah, that's a story. I was teaching this once, and a student said, I have to tell you a story. Their elderly, grandfather was sick, and he was also diabetic, and pretty sick, but not dying yet, and he needed an insulin shot. And I don't know who it was, I don't remember all the people, but it was a nurse or a doctor, and they said to the family, should we just skip that? And the family was shocked. They were like, no, it will provide some comfort. It's like $3 or something for an insulin shot. And so, you can't judge people's hearts if you're not there, but the sense I get from that story, which I think the student got, was they were just trying to throw things in to make the person die sooner. Or they were thinking of the person as futile. No, you give them that insulin shot if that's going to be a source of comfort. That's part of ordinary care. So some cases of assisted breathing, there's a lot of discussion about that. I think some cases are ordinary care. And then, of course, the most important, I told Dr. Traveline's story already, the most important is love. Loving the person when they're at their most vulnerable. Okay. And see, the point is, I don't know if I have that on a slide. Yes. This means that there are some things which, no matter one's intentions, if done to another person, cannot not be the opposite to love. I try to make a strong example because sometimes it's tricky. People can't see right away that not feeding someone with artificial nutrition hydration is ordinary care. It is. But then there's some little qualifications you'll hear about. But to make the point, what if you went into like a home where one of your elderly loved ones were, and they had bed sores, and you went to the staff and said, what's going on here? And they said, oh, we did that because of love and compassion for that person. It doesn't even compute. It can't be. That's, if you don't provide ordinary care, it must be the opposite of love. So, before I go to the next slide, so now the euthanasia side and the pro-life side, they both say that they have compassion on their side, right? They're the compassionate and loving one. But the pro-life side says it follows from compassion and love, never kill. But the pro-euthanasia side says it follows from compassion and love, kill. So there must be some way to show that what they both mean by compassion and love aren't the same. In fact, they got to be opposites. Now this would take, even though there could be some elements of love in the compassion and love on the pro-euthanasia, like the loving desire for a person to be relieved of pain. That's a genuine loving desire. But when it switches to killing, then there's something of the opposite of love there. And this is one little thing that maybe helps to begin the discussion of expressing the opposition of love. There are more than one opposite to love. The most obvious opposite to love is hatred. Now, most people who participate in euthanasia, I doubt, hate the guts of the person they're euthanizing. A second opposite to love is use. So that's like what Wojtyła writes about in Love and Responsibility. The opposite, he criticizes the opposite to love, which is using people as objects. But a third opposite to love is abandonment or being indifferent to somebody. In fact, oftentimes people will say, if you start philosophizing about these, if there's somebody who should love you and they don't, would you rather have them hate you or ignore you? And most people will say hate, because at least they're paying attention to you. They're reacting to your... But if they ignore you, it's even more painful in some ways. They're both horrible, but being totally ignored or abandoned. And I think that this would be maybe an initial step, that the reason why euthanasia is the opposite to love and not love is because it's an act of abandonment of a person who is in their most vulnerable state. It's right then that they need to be surrounded the most. They need to know that their loved ones love them and are there. And euthanasia is like society putting them in a room and shutting the door on them. Sort of, that's an analogy. I think the act of killing, because people want to say, what's wrong with killing? and I'm not going to develop it more right now, but I think that act of killing is the opposite to love of abandoning someone when they're vulnerable. It's why it's an opposite to love. And this, what Pope Benedict says to Francesco's mother here, that's why he says saddest of situations, because he's in such a state, but that takes a lot of effort and time. You know, there's a whole theory on caring for caregivers, because, but that type of effort is love. That's love, not killing them. Like you could almost say euthanasia is selfish, an act of selfishness of caregivers. Now, as I said before, we're not judging people's hearts. It's confusing, and people need to understand. That's why we need a proper ethos of death and dying to rise to the occasion to care for the. Okay. So yes, there's what I just said. This is just a quick slide. Maybe I should skip some of these side points, but this article by Ignatius Perkins, he's a Dominican and he's also, I think, a nurse. It's a beautiful article. I already did my NFL analogy. But in that article, he actually did a study, and I didn't know this until I read it. I guess it's sort of common in nursing homes and places like that to use feeding tubes when they're not necessary to save money from having to hire people to hand feed people or be with people. So there, you could say the letter of the law is being fulfilled if they're getting nutrition and hydration, but he writes about in there, I'm pretty sure it's in that article, this idea of a meal. A meal is such a human, like even the Mass and a family meal. And this whole idea of a meal and being together has a rich ethos. And that needs to be incorporated into caring for the people who are sick. In that book by Atul Gawande is very worth reading about. He talks about different nursing homes and people who've tried to make them more human. And there's a lady in Italy making beautiful architecture and paintings in them, which used to have paintings in the Middle Ages by great artists in each hospital room. But yeah. So I had a friend who from college who passed away, and he had a lot of siblings, and I would go there, and his room was, it was almost like a party in there. Like they'd bring his food, but it was at the Mayo Clinic, and those are in circles, and you could see across. There'd be people in rooms all day long with nobody visiting them. So it's like an effort that's needed to. All right, I said this already. This is a very important point about the laws. In cases when death is near, it is difficult to discern if this or that thing is extraordinary or ordinary. Sometimes it's hard to figure it out. So there what you do is you pray. Your heart is in the right place. You don't want to kill the person. You want to care for them. And then you do your best. You talk to the doctor, you talk to your priest, you discuss it with your family, you pray, and then you make a decision at some point. Okay, we think this is extraordinary, but we're still going to do this care. Those are hard situations, and you just got to do your best and trust God. But these laws are not about those difficult situations. Some of these laws will apply when there are difficult situations, but I just want to make the point that the laws legalizing euthanasia aren't about, oh, Jesus, this euthanasia, is this extraordinary or ordinary? No, the laws are about killing people on purpose. That's what they are about. They want to legalize that. Not, we're caring, but is it okay to take this? No, they want to kill people. That's what the laws are about. And you just got to be honest about it. And they're honest about it too. The people who passed the laws, if you read Singer's articles, he's like, of course we're killing people. There's nothing wrong with it, according to him. That's what we want to legalize. Okay, I sort of already said this part, so I'll skip it. Okay, living wills. I'm going to maybe skip these two, and maybe we'll hear about it more later. But generally, there's two categories of end-of-life document. There's more subcategories, but one is these things with lots of details in them, and one is like a power of attorney where there's somebody you know, love, believes what you believe, and will think about the situation when all the things are happening and make the right decisions according to you if you can't. And that's more in tune with the Catholic approach than these check boxes and things, because it actually makes it more confusing for the family if it says, remove all life-sustaining treatment. Or some of these ones I read in New York or Pennsylvania, I do not want food and water. I know, this is in some of these legal documents, I know that I will die by starvation and dehydration because of this, and this is not to be construed as suicide. It says that in the law. So you have to be very careful with those. There's all different documents, and there's the whole post and most, and maybe we'll hear more about that later. But that's a general point, that it's better to go low on specifics. If there's specifics, make them Catholic, and just find someone you know and love who you can talk, who you communicate with a lot. Okay. So I said this. Oh no, this is a new point. Painkillers to alleviate the sufferings of the dying, even at the risk of shortening their days, can be morally in conformity with human dignity if death is not willed as an end or a means, but only foreseen. And here, in palliative care is a special form of disinterested charity. So we didn't define the principle of double effect. It's on your handout. I'm not going to do it now, but that's true. I'm just going to assert it rather than bring it to evidence fully. That palliative care, Catholics, we do, if someone chooses to accept a little more pain for redemptive suffering, that's good, but no, people should not be in pain. We don't want that. So palliative care is good. It's good. Some forms of pain relief will shorten life, but your intention is not that they die sooner, it's to relieve pain, and that's a foreseen, unintended side effect. You wish it wouldn't happen. Pius XII makes he distinguishes in his article on this between pain medications that don't really hinder consciousness and ones that do. And he says it's a special question for pain medications that diminish consciousness because dying is a human act. And so you want to be awake as much as possible so you can talk to your loved ones and so on and so forth. Let me just get through that, but write them down. I'll try to get through in enough. Okay, yeah, so now, this is really striking. And the reason I was in my first class, I think, in graduate school for philosophy. It was called Philosophy of Suffering and Death. And I'm pretty sure it was the first day, and the teacher, I was lucky, graced to be able to have Rocco Buttiglione as my professor. I don't know if you know, he's an expert on John Paul II. But anyways, he taught us this course, Philosophy of Suffering and Death. And on the first day, he made this comment. He said, if you look at paintings from the Middle Ages, I have a few coming up here, you will find expressed in those paintings this idea of Ars Moriendi that we have lost. Okay? So I'm going to have a few, so later I tried to find some. He was right. All right. But this one is painted by Pablo Picasso. He had a realistic stage. I don't know if you can see that. Okay, that's called Faith and Science. And here the doctor is attending to the sick person, but her face, you see, is looking at the nun who represents religion and the child who represents family. So medicine, family, and faith are together, but death is approaching, and this is what's important now, although he's still here. Okay, all right. And then this is part, I have the whole tomb coming up. This is in St. Peter's Basilica. It's by John Lorenzo Bernini. It's over a doorway, and that's death. Bernini made marble look like a blanket. And there's death. His face is covered by the blanket because you never know when he's coming, but there's an hourglass, he is coming. And that is, well, I'll get to that in a minute. So here, why is death a human act? There was a prayer, you know. If you ask people today how they want to die, what do they say? Surrounded by loved ones. Yeah, or what? Or in your sleep, hit by a Mack truck, but no pain. There used to be a prayer that Catholics prayed regularly. "O Lord, deliver me from a sudden death." People actually used to pray for the exact opposite of what everyone wants today. Because things happen during that approach of your death, like you might make the most sincere confession you ever made in your life, or you will say things to people you love that you've been afraid to say up until then, and reconciliations happen. You might think about the meaning of life more than ever before. So there's all sorts of things that happen, which, if you kill people before they go through a natural dying process, they will be deprived of. And people used to know that. They almost wanted to be able to participate in those. Okay, they did. So that's the tomb from before. I don't know if you can see it, but here's where the death with the hourglass is, and that's a doorway. And it's right to the, if you're standing at the Baldacchino in St. Peter's, the papal altar, that is right to the left. Now the Pope, the sacristy's back there. But he used to go under there. And when you come out of the sacristy in St. Peter's, there's a huge mosaic of Ananias and Sapphira dead. And the idea is that when the priest comes out of the sacristy or goes under that door, the Pope, after all this is Memento Mori, after all this pomp and glory, people are practically worshiping the Pope, he leaves under death to remind him that he is dust. And this idea of Memento Mori, or like the Carthusians, they were silent, but they had lay brothers. When someone came to visit the Carthusians, the lay brother could go to the door and open it and welcome the person. And the greeting was, "Brother, remember your death." So it can be macabre if you do it too much, but this idea of Memento Mori is healthy. It's an important part of life, to once in a while sit down and think, not death happens, but I am going to die. That's one of those last things that make you recollect. Okay? All right. That's a part of our faith. It gets expressed in art. Have you been to the Capuchin Boneyard Church? So there's this. So it's at I forget where, but it's Piazza Barberini, Via Veneto. It's the most wealthy. That's another point about this. Right next to this Boneyard Church is a Lamborghini shop. So when I would bring students there before I went inside, I would say, "If you like my tour and you want to get me a gift," but the reason why, so there was an ossuary there with hundreds and hundreds of bones in it, and they didn't know they have to empty it to put more dead people in, and so it's not known who, but some Capuchin from 300 years or so ago collected all the bones, separated them into shoulder blades and vertebrae, and made a set of chapels out of them. All bones, and you have to go. I had a girl run out of there hyperventilating. You go downstairs. It's like a dirt floor. The chandeliers, they're about this high to me. They're made out of human bones. They have light bulbs screwed in them. And you look at the chapels and you see death. And some people think, oh, it's macabre or it's disrespectful to those dead people. But I don't know. There's another theory that says, the last one, you probably heard this phrase, but in the last chapel, it says under there, what you are now, we once were, and what we are now, you will be. And I think they built it here in Via Veneto, which has always been a wealthy place, even back in the Renaissance, to show the wealthy people that they're mortal, like that other one showed the Pope, that he's mortal. So Memento Mori, it's Memento Mori in our faith, in our art. So now the next thing is Memento Mori and Ars Moriendi. So this is pretty neat. There were these prayer books. The next few pictures I'm going to show you are from prayer books, and I think the first couple might be hard to see. And a lot of these were created after things like the Black Death and so forth, when there weren't many priests around and lots of people were dying. And they wanted to help people be able to prepare for death even if they didn't have a priest. And so they made these books, and one of them, which is really interesting, one type of them is they have a picture in the book of a typical temptation that will hit you when you're dying and its corresponding virtue. So you could meditate on that and prepare better for your death. So here I tried to put verses next to them all. So patience is what I'm focusing on this one. So I don't know if you can see this, but there's two. It's about the temptation to impatience when you're sick. So I don't know if you can see this guy, but his leg is sticking out of the blanket. He kicked over all of his food. The nun is really sad. How am I going to feed this guy? He's like yelling at her. So it's a picture of an impatient sick person in a prayer book. And then the virtue of patience. Here you see him. He's got a very patient look on his face. He's laying down. He's surrounded by angels. And the devil's sort of running away. He lost. So they would look at these and they'd say, okay, I'm going to be sick. I'm not going to want to eat. And it's a way to get ready. Okay, then here, do not let your hearts be troubled. In my Father's house there are many dwelling places, Jesus says. So here's another one. The temptation is the attachment to worldly goods. So here's the sick guy. Here's two devils. They're pointing at his house, at his servant, at his horse, at his barn. You're going to lose all this. That's what he's saying. Attachment to his worldly goods. And then, look at this. All these things gone. Jesus naked on the cross. Nothing. He's saying, you can do it, Lord. Dying naked, I can do it too. And he's at peace. So they would look at these. These are the typical temptations that would hit you. Now there's more. I don't have more of the temptations, but I have the final frame. It's quite beautiful. It's hard to see it, but right here, there's an angel, or maybe it's Christ, pulling. It's a little human body. It represents his soul, sort of out of his mouth, bringing him up to heaven. Because he did the Memento Mori and the Ars Moriendi, his soul is being saved. And the devils are all mad down here. They lost a soul because he used the book. Okay. All right. Now, okay, so here, when people, there's one more picture I want to show you, and then we can do Q&A. So when people ask to be killed, they really mean other things, and that's something else Wesley Smith writes about. You have to listen to their heart. Oh, there's a book that just came out. It's called Why You Shouldn't Kill Yourself. It's by, the author's name is Susan Windley Dowd. I should remember her last name, but it's published by Cascade, which is published out of Oregon. Why You Shouldn't Kill Yourself. And it's called 5 Tricks of the Heart. It's a little volume. It's very beautifully. She sensitively analyzes these sorts of things that are going on in the hearts of people who are asking for euthanasia. And she offers words that you can use to respond to their heart rather than their words. And okay, so I recommend that book. Okay. All right, now, but it's an anguished plea for help. What a sick person needs, besides medical care, is love, human warmth, and so forth. Then Pope Benedict has this beautiful line in Deus Caritas Est, going beyond exterior appearances, I can perceive in others an interior desire for a sign of love and concern. This I can offer them not only through the organizations and technical training. I can give to others much more than their outward necessities. I can give them the look of love which they crave. And someone said at the stairs last night, how do you protect your heart when you're pouring it out for these people and they're dying? It's like you're getting wounded back and forth. And the answer is not to become a stoic, because the patient needs that look of love which they crave, Benedict says. So there's some training of your heart over time. It'll be different probably for each one of you. But I put these quotes up because this is quite striking. So this is an example of one of the paintings that my professor was saying about. It's from 1440, Book of Hours. And it's so interesting. So here you have the sick person. And remember, one of my first slides was, is the sick person the center of attention, or are they being ignored? Well, in the painting, the sick person is in the geographical center of the painting to make the point that the sick person is the center of attention. And then you have 2 puffy pillows, which are like comfort. And then here maybe are his sisters or his cousin or somebody holding his hands and touching his head, caring for him. Here you have a priest preparing the last rites and oils and things. Here, I mean, you have to guess a little bit, but here it's either a nun or maybe it's his soon-to-be widow starting her mourning and praying for him, sitting at the bedside. Here's maybe 2 of his friends preparing his will. Here's a doctor checking his urine. I don't know if you can see that little bottle of yellow fluid. So something like that. And then I never noticed this. A friend of mine just pointed it out to me. The 4 panes, 3 of the panes are black and one's clear, and you could see a blue sky. So maybe it's sort of a representation of death is coming, but there's hope here. So these kinds of paintings are expressions of the Catholic idea of Ars Moriendi. And they were in these prayer books that people would look at and think about. Okay? Now, I think modern medicine is great. I have benefited from it. And probably you all have. So what I'm about to do next isn't a critique of modern medicine, but I found a picture on the internet. I don't know if I should use it because it has people's faces in it who I don't know, but I just want to contrast this image with that image. There you have a hand on a metal bar. Here you have a hand touching 2 loving sisters. There you have someone looking down at a tray. There you have rows instead of a bedroom. So it's sort of a harsh contrast. I know I'm not saying all modern medicine doesn't love people, but I just wanted to contrast the whole ethos that used to be a part of Catholic thought, which was called Ars Moriendi. All right, I think I have a couple more slides, but I'm just going to stop and we can do some Q&A. Okay, we'll do 1, 2, 3, 4. I'll try to do 5. I'll try to do it.
My question is, these patients that are in ICU,
Yeah.
they were declared brain dead.
Oh.
So, for how long do you think we should encourage
Right. So,
keeping them?
yeah. Excuse me? Okay. Now that's a topic, we actually don't have a lecture on it. I'll say a few little quick things, but we won't. The question is brain death. Sorry, brain death. Brain death. Sorry. Thank you. Thank you for laughing after I ignored what you told me to do. So there is a debate among Catholics who are faithful to the Church about whether brain death is death. I do not think brain death is death, but I'm pretty sure the next speaker does. So, and we're friends. But I don't know, because the way you phrased your question, you might have been asking me just extraordinary treatment in general, how long? Well, that is a decision, like I said before, that is unique to each situation. So it really is the determination of the family and the whole situation. There is no answer to that. Okay, all right, so let's just leave. And then if we get in, well, I don't know if we have any more panels, we could develop the terms of the debate or the state of the question on brain death, but I don't think I'm going to do that right now. Okay, I forgot who was next. Yeah, I think you were next. Yeah.
So I guess I'm tempted to ask about, you describe there's this watershed difference between people who support euthanasia, even if they have strong parameters around it, and those who do not, and that the difference is whether or not killing is ever justified. But I don't know very much about just war theory, but I'm curious. It seems like maybe in some context the church has already done that 180.
Well, okay, it's a good question. She's asking me about why does the church be in favor of just war or even capital punishment historically and not euthanasia? Okay, right. But so I'll recommend to you. I'll do a brief comment. If you look in Evangelium Vitae, we've heard about that a few times this week in the Gospel of Life, paragraphs 55 and 56. In there is this very beautiful statement, or that we respect life, but then there's this paradox, because we also have a duty to protect people like our family members or our country. So and sometimes you have to use force, and sometimes that force might be lethal. So the church recognizes in that section there, 55 and 56, that it's a struggle which you are recognizing. But one thing I like to say is that with capital punishment and war, the fundamental concept is you're killing because of evil or something bad. But with you kill someone because they're bad. And I'll say something else about that in a second. But with euthanasia, you're saying, I'm killing because they're sick. That's ridiculous. It's not the same thing. So now, but capital punishment, though, as you notice, the church is going more and more trying to say, no, there used to be lots of reasons why it was legitimate, and now the only reason they're saying it can still be legitimate is if you can't stop the person from hurting other people. But even in that case, like Benedict and John Paul and Francis are saying that we have the technology to, even in that case, not to kill them. And I think it's somehow connected to what I said before about abandonment, okay? So even killing someone because they're bad, it's a form of abandonment. It's like a loss of hope and redemption and so forth. So that we could have to flesh out. And that's another one of those debates right now in the church. Like some people, like Edward Fazar, is arguing really strongly for capital punishment. I don't agree with what he's doing, but okay. Yep.
I just have a question about what you were talking about palliative sedation, and if you could kind of clarify, I think in this case, the subtle distinction between like the principle of double effect there, but also understanding that like the ends can't justify the means. So I'm kind of confused by like how that's or not palliative sedation, maybe, but knowing that like giving someone pain medication might actually hasten their death.
Right. So there is, and later in the clinical parts, the doctors can talk about the real living of it and doing it. But there is a distinction, actually. There's steps to get this clear, which you have to develop in a semester, but between intending something and foreseeing something. So for example, if you are standing here looking out there, and let's say there is a car going really fast and, an animal on the sidewalk, and you know for sure that animal is going to get hit. Like the way it's set up, you're like, okay, that's unavoidable. And then it happens. You did not intend that. You were like, I wish that wasn't going to happen. But you did foresee it correctly. So that just gives you, there is a fundamental distinction between foreseeing and intending. So if you are, and we are in favor of relieving pain. So what you're intending is the act that you're going to do is going to have two effects. That's the principle of double effect. One is good, one is bad. The act is administering pain-relieving drugs. The good effect is less pain. The bad effect is shortened life. You are not intending the shortened life. You actually wish you had a way to relieve this person's pain without shortening their life. But you know it's going to happen. But okay, that's the first part. Then, so you're not intending, you're doing something that's good or neutral, relieving pain. You're not intending that. You're only foreseeing it. Then, the shortened life, the third part of the principle of double effect, is that the bad effect can't be the cause of the good effect. And it's not. Their death isn't the reason why they're not in pain. The pain-relieving powers of the drug is the reason why. And then the fourth part of the principle of double effect is there has to be a proportionately grave reason for permitting the bad effect. And there is in this case, excruciating pain. And for the principle of double effect, all those four parts have to be met or else it doesn't apply. Okay? So that's a short answer. You're not, okay. But was there someone else who I said was for? Okay, you, okay.
Could you speak a little bit more about how legalizing something is the same as suggesting it? Because I feel like there are a lot of people out there who believe that if something's
Okay.
Maybe like a good example to give them about why that's like realizing something is the same as endorsing something.
I'll say two quick things about it. One is that legalizing something is saying something. It's the whole society saying something. And then the other thing is, and this goes all the way back to Aristotle and Nicomachean Ethics, it's really striking. In the parts where he talks about legislators, he says that the most important feature of a legislator is that he is a virtuous person. And the reason, he says, is because the most important job of politicians is to help citizens become virtuous. And then he says that the law, Aristotle actually says this, the law is integral to that. So politicians, it's not the only, Aristotle has about 7 different things that help us become virtuous. And one of them is laws. He thinks and why? Because he says the law habituates the citizens. And so a simple way to put it in our day and age is, it is true, sort of by osmosis, that if something is legal, people think it is right. That happens. Aristotle knew it. So that's why he thought politicians, and especially legislators, have to be virtuous, because they have to be very careful about crafting laws that match the natural law. And so there is or Benedict, John Paul talks about, I think I have a slide. Hold on a second. Yeah, look at this. In Theology of the Body, he says, we can deduce the content of ethos from the structures and institutions of society. So the idea is that, so the ethos, it's hard to put a word on ethos, but it's like the moral spirit of a culture. And that creates the institutions of a culture. And John Paul here is saying, if you look at the institutions of a culture, you can see the ethical spirit of that culture. If you look back to those paintings of the Middle Ages, they had a spirit that was rooted in this Ars Moriendi, and our culture is rooted in like a culture of death, you could say. And the law is a huge player in that. And it's part of the structure of sin. Okay.
When I've heard classmates talk about euthanasia or assisted suicide, sometimes they bring up like euthanizing an animal, and
Yeah.
obviously that's different. But it does confuse me a little bit why euthanizing a sick animal almost is represented as like a good, and you're mean if you don't do it, and you let your cat continue to suffer instead of just morally acceptable.
Yeah.
Because the animal doesn't have
Yeah.
the same dignity. And so I'm just curious if you think that euthanizing a sick animal is actually a positive, a moral good, and you should have a responsibility to do that.
Interesting.
Does it influence how people think about killing
Yeah.
humans?
Okay, so she said, we put down pets, why not people? People ask that. But this is a deeper way to formulate the question. And that's also a profound question. So the first answer is, from what we were saying the other day, there is a fundamental gap between human dignity and being an animal. And we did some of that before. And I try to develop that a little bit in the chapter in Catholic Witness that I wrote. And so therefore, you can never kill a person, but you can kill an animal. We'd have to develop it more, especially if we were dealing. But now, so that's an interesting point. The relationship between humans and animals. In one sense, it's a little bit skewed in our culture now, because people are replacing children with dogs. That's an aberration. But there's a beautiful, true relationship between humans and animals, written about in poetry, and also just one's own pets. And there, a certain sadness and this desire to know whether we're going to see our pet again in heaven, those are actually beautiful thoughts. So I agree with you that there shouldn't be a flippant sort of attitude. And of course, torturing animals is immoral. So I guess I would say you're onto something there. There's a certain ethos to the human-animal relationship which has been beautifully represented in all sorts of poetry and true stories and stuff that is part of that whole thing. There's a sadness when your pet dies, and you do need to be consoled and think about some meaning of life. But then there is that gap. And you can kill animals, you can't kill people. This one is intrinsically very immoral, this one is not. But to develop it further, to bring to evidence the sources of the dignity of the person like we did already, self-transcendence and incommunicability and so forth. And I'll recommend one interesting book by Max Shaler. It's called Man's Place in the Cosmos. Man's Place in the Cosmos. And he actually wrote it after he left the Catholic faith. But it's a very striking distinction between showing that difference between animals and man. So that's a few comments. Any other thoughts or question? Max Shaler, Shaler. I talk about him a little bit in my chapter. Yeah.
On that with animals, though, like, in a sense, us putting down our pets, like, it's like, because we also don't want to see it suffering. There's
Oh.
a point of abandonment of our own pets, but, like, it's, like, kind of a non-thing abandonment because you can't kill animals, because, like, we gave it a higher dignity, not a higher dignity, but, like, that we ascribe, like, it's okay to kill animals, but, like, it was, like, our dog, you know? Am I
Yeah.
thinking that right? Like, it's okay because, like, if you are putting them out of their suffering, you are putting yourself out of your suffering.
And that reminds me of something else that I wanted to say. That feeling, there's a feeling of relief that you have when someone you love who was in pain dies because they're not in pain anymore. That feeling of relief is good. It's okay. It's good to be happy, especially if also you have faith to add to that and they're in heaven. But you can never get to that feeling by killing a person. But it is interesting that that feeling of relief that you want your pet not to be in pain is also good. And that one, you can kill the pet. Okay? All right. Yes.
I want to say about killing the pet that is suffering.
Yeah.
I thought that it was right because they cannot sanctify pain as a human can do. Like you can bind to Jesus in the cross
Yeah.
suffering,
Yeah.
whereas a pet cannot because they cannot go. Well, maybe they will go to heaven, whatever. But they don't.
Yeah.
They don't. I don't know.
Yeah, that's one reason. There's lots of reasons why you should never kill people. And one of them is... it also... All right. And one of them is that redemptive suffering dimension that you bring out. One of them is it kills the ethos of love, and there's lots of them. We've talked about some. Maybe last question. Yeah.
I'm just like, well, maybe I just need to hear it again, but your reasoning behind like the, I don't know, morality of how it's okay for people not to feel pain, but people still, I don't know, say like need to suffer or like have
Yes.
suffering in their life, and like how you differentiate between that kind of in our stance. Like,
Yeah, that's a good question. So why is the fact that Catholics think redemptive suffering is good, does that contradict the fact that Catholics are in favor of relieving pain? No, it's not a contradiction. If one thing is, if it's serious pain, then someone can choose to forego even pain relief to offer it up. That's beautiful. But I think the basic answer, and Frankl talks about this in Man's Search for Meaning, and he's Jewish, and this fits, I think, with the Catholic view. I think, there's a common sense element here. If you have a broken arm, go get it set, because that's taking care of yourself. That would be wrong, I think, to keep your broken arm for redemptive suffering. But if there is like maybe you got to start on the ends and come to the middle. If there is an unavoidable suffering, then those are the times when you have to prepare yourself for it and be able to make the right movements of your heart to embrace that in the various ways like those pictures showed, and also as redemptive suffering and offering it up or so forth. So there's a training of the heart to accept redemptive suffering so we can end up more like those people who prayed the prayer that I quoted rather than the capos in the concentration camps. Because Freud thought, at the beginning of Frankl's book, he says, Freud said that if you torture people, all of them, and starve them, they will all become beasts in the thirst for survival. And then Frankl said Freud was wrong because all of his patients were wealthy, middle-aged, primarily women on a comfortable couch. He never lived in a concentration camp. And there you got the opposites, the most opposite. You got Maximilian Kolbe and the capos. And Frankl wanted to know why. Why was Freud so wrong? And he said the reason was because how those became was not the results of camp influences alone. It was the result primarily, he says, of an inner decision. Now, we need grace and help. So I think that's part of the answer, that when there's unavoidable suffering, the Christian is prepared with the idea of redemptive suffering. It gives us an opportunity to unleash love, but we have to participate in that. Or like St. Paul says, I make up for the lack of the sufferings of Christ in my own sufferings. I'm messing up the verse. But John Paul comments on that, and he says, it doesn't mean that Christ's suffering wasn't enough. It means that we are genuinely able to participate in his redemptive suffering in some mysterious way. But we have to participate in it. So that's what I would say. So there's a common sense side where, yeah, if you can fix a problem, fix it. But then, but it's a deep question, actually. That's why some people, I said at the beginning, think Christianity is different from all the other attempts to deal with suffering. Every worldview is attempt, at least part of its heart, is to try to deal with the question of suffering and death, all of them. And most of them, like Stoicism and hedonism, all of them and all those kinds are trying to get rid of the experience of suffering. But Christianity says we can embrace it. And there are layers in your conscious life. You can have people who are in lots of pain, but they're deeply happy. And you can have people who are surfeited with pleasures, and they're deeply unhappy. So happiness and pleasure and unhappiness and pain aren't the same. And the idea of Christianity, one idea is that suffering, or these martyrs, we hear about these martyrs in Mass. Shaler makes this point. The reason they were so happy actually wasn't because they knew they were going to get a reward. They were actually happy. They were deeply happy because of their... Kolbe said that. Someone said, how are you doing this? How are you helping everybody and giving away your food? He said, supposedly, his answer was, I don't know how to describe it except to say that I'm happy. I'm deeply happy. So there's an inner happiness that can come from being united with Christ in the midst of suffering. So, okay, 15-minute break. Thank you. Thank you.